Welcome to the Global Hydrogen Interview Series, also known as the Full Court Press, where we take a rapid-fire look at a market that some are calling the new oil of the 21st century. My name is 𝗨𝗱𝗲𝗲𝗍𝗂. I'm the director of the Energy Transition Dialogue at 𝗨𝗃𝗲𝗄�intelligence, and with me today is Richard Power. He is partner at 𝗨𝗃𝗄𝗿𝗀. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Michelle. How are you?
I'm very well, and thank you very much for joining us. How's everything with you?
Very good, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here and discussing what's such an important topic.
Well, I'm glad you're here because it is such an important topic, and there's so much changing as well. And keeping abreast of it is turning into quite a job for everybody, I think. So just starts off with some broad strokes. Oil majors are clearly facing higher scrutiny and climate risk disclosure. We've seen some jaw-dropping headlines even in the last month. Earlier this year, we saw 𝗥𝗲𝗄𝗿𝗀𝗲𝗍𝗏 lose 3 of its board seats to a small activist investor, which has been pressing the company to cut emissions. Another case, we saw a Dutch court ruled that Shell needs to slash its greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels, forcing the company to make some hard choices. But most importantly, it took quite a hit in terms of reputational value and was in the headlines for reasons that it absolutely did not want to be. And frankly, it sent shockwaves of concern throughout many parts of the traditional energy markets. How do you think, from a legal perspective, there can be greater protection, greater proactivity, especially in such a new market like green hydrogen, in terms of it growing? It's not new in itself, but in terms of its growth.
I think there's probably a number of aspects there. You know, what you say is absolutely true. What we've seen in the last year at 𝗨𝗃𝗄𝗿𝗀 is speaking with our clients in the energy sector, is an appreciation that dealing with climate change, dealing with the energy transition has moved from something which is nice to do, something which is good or right to do, to something which is posing legal challenges and has to be done. You referred to the Royal Dutch Shell case there, the 𝗥𝗲𝗄𝗏𝗍𝗏𝗏 board changes, which happened in the space of a couple of days. And this has got real. We're seeing it affect our clients in so many different ways. The most obvious is embracing different energy sources and methods of energy production. So embracing hydrogen, a move to embrace renewables, a move to embrace energy tech, and thinking of different ways of doing what has to be done to provide energy to customers. But we're also seeing it in other different ways, which is looking at the obligation to make climate-related disclosures in financial statements. What are the liabilities on directors for making those for inaccurate statements, claims for greenwashing? We're seeing clients looking at their contractual chains and what terms can be inserted in contracts in the supply chain to ensure that everyone's aligned on net zero. And we're also seeing a growing number of claims for damage for climate change and pollution. So it's happening all across the sphere. All those legal drivers will, I think, enhance and speed up the energy transition and become a huge incentive for players in the energy market to embrace hydrogen and embrace these new green sources of energy.
Because some investors see hydrogen, especially green hydrogen, as a higher risk investment that they're not yet quite comfortable with. And it seems to be especially true for those who have traditionally worked outside energy markets altogether. And they're trying to embrace other greener and more proven markets like solar power and wind power. You know, already that's a big step for them. Already that feels quite exploratory for them. So to be going into blue and green hydrogen is, whoa, just, you know, give us some time to adjust. We just need a bit of time. That's a truly new market that's growing, despite its potential, is truly at the very early stages. So from a positive standpoint, we could argue that you just mentioned about the contractual chains there and the need to have due diligence throughout them, which for major international companies must be extremely difficult to do. And those same major international companies are the ones who are going to be under the greatest scrutiny. So they're very much between a rock and a hard place if they don't get it right. Could we argue that hydrogen has a great benefit, or a great launch pad maybe, that those mistakes when it comes to those contractual changes are made in the other existing established energy markets, even the renewables markets, so that the lessons learned can be applied to hydrogen? Could it be swung that way so that investors feel more comfortable? It's okay, all the mistakes have been made with these other markets, and sorting out these contractual chains and sorting out the greenwashing concerns and the due diligence, everything you've just mentioned. Actually, now we can move forward with a much more robust and safe hydrogen growth. Is that too optimistic? Yes.
I think to a certain extent that's true, but I'm going to take issue with your proposal that this is cutting edge and therefore high risk. And you're right, a lot of investors are looking upon this as being something, a step into the unknown. But when you stop and think about it, hydrogen is produced as a byproduct of so many industrial and chemical processes already. And a client said to me that he was speaking to a very large oil major in the Middle East region, and he was talking about hydrogen and embracing hydrogen. And they looked at him and said, well, this is it's nothing new to us. We're actually already the biggest producer of hydrogen. It just happens to be that the hydrogen molecules are attached to other molecules at the moment. So
there's an education standpoint there, isn't there?
Precisely. And if you look at if you look at the two sources of it, you've got green hydrogen, which is embracing renewables, which is already a technology which is very far advanced and is getting more and more cost effective and efficient.
Truly proven now.
Exactly. So picking up on what you said before, I think that there is those comforts to be had, but the other comfort is that I'm looking at green hydrogen, that the technology is already quite far advanced, and it's then just the question of honing the process of the hydrogen production in large quantities. Exactly. And then you look at blue hydrogen, that's probably the more tricky process, and you've got carbon capture and storage. And I know a lot of people in the energy sector who wince when you talk about CCUS, because there's been problems with it, but the technology is there, and it's just a question of developing it. That's more risky. But I think on green hydrogen, as you say, when investors and others get past the initial fear of stepping into the unknown and actually break it down, I think there's comfort to be obtained already, that it's not so risky. And you then balance that with the benefits of embracing this green future, and I think that people have to be careful where they invest their money, and it's always a question of risk and reward. But I think the rewards here are possibly understated and the risks overstated.
I think that's a very interesting take on it in terms of the understated versus overstated angle of it, because the potential is absolutely humongous, isn't it? It's gargantuan. It is fair to describe it. And I think, as you say, when we have our conversations as well, often it's a case of, well, it's a whole new market, or it's, it's starting from scratch, which of course it isn't starting from scratch at all. It's the scalability of the market, and the need for the support and the regulatory support, the financial support, the environmental checklists as well. And then, like you mentioned on the CCS side, that's a whole nother infrastructure supply chain that needs to be developed as well. And there are lots of grand promises, and there have been, but it's still taking quite a bit of time to get the scale up on projects on that side that are needed for it to truly fulfill its potential. So it's that fear factor as well, that you say is quite significant when it comes to overcoming this barrier when it comes to hydrogen, green hydrogen and blue hydrogen.
I think that there is that. I think that the involvement of the state in a number of different ways will give it a huge helping hand, because the thing that strikes me about hydrogen is it's almost too good to be true. it's a substance which is a source of energy. It's a substance which can transport energy or store energy. Truly, almost the holy grail of the energy
and it's
transition.
abundant as well.
Exactly. Yeah. I've heard people speak about, for instance, in the UK, using hydrogen in central heating. Again, the technology's there. The safety case needs to be made. The regulations need to catch up, and the government support for introducing it needs to be there. But what I'm detecting is a willingness around the world, not just in the UK, not just in Europe, but Middle East and South America in particular, to embrace this because of the potentiality of hydrogen. I think a number of nations have worked out that they can become exporters of hydrogen, and therefore
the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Exactly, a huge player in that market. And it's been very interesting to see how the UAE has been very ready to embrace this as a strategic concept in the energy transition, to make them a global player in that. And I think, as I say, when you have the support of the state, you know that the regulatory and legal framework will follow, and the support will encourage the private sector to invest in that technology.
What are you seeing from your clients when it comes to those cross-border partnerships? Because we just mentioned Saudi Arabia then, but we've seen it get very public and firm nods of interest to collaborate when it comes to hydrogen markets, especially green and blue, from Moscow, from major European cities. It did the first export of blue ammonia last year to Japan. NEOM project, $5 billion underway, potentially one of the world's biggest green hydrogen projects. There's a lot. The list, it goes on and on. There's a lot of development going on. But when it comes to those cross-border partnerships from Moscow, from Germany, and so on, do you think that the right ecosystem is in place already to be able to truly maximize that potential, or do you think a lot needs to be done, that more perhaps from the legal world can be done to help give greater confidence?
It's a good question, and we go back, I suppose, to the question of how different, how new is this market? If you take a step back and you talk about commodities trading, and you talk about energy supply, and if you can draw a parallel to what is already being done in the export of hydrocarbons and its regulation and the legal framework that needs to be there in order to encourage investment, cross-border collaboration, joint ventures, again, I think that it doesn't take a huge step then of a huge leap of faith to think, well, actually, that not much needs to be done in a major sense to apply that to hydrogen. The most important things, it seems to me, when you're talking about cross-border collaboration, is investment protection and
reputational protection, as a byproduct of that.
Or
chicken and egg, maybe chicken and egg.
Yeah, that and of course protection of revenue streams, and because that's the way the world works, and people will invest in something if they think that they can make money from it and that their investment will be safe. And when I talk about safe, not necessarily from technological risk or economic risk, but from expropriation or arbitrary imposition of rules which suddenly make it
the red tape.
Exactly. And I think that the basics are already there. It will need to be tweaked for hydrogen, of course it will. But I think the basics are already there. And if you look at something like the Energy Charter Treaty, not so much applicable to the Middle East, but for the signatories of that protects investments in energy, in the energy sector. And it's pretty agnostic in that sense. And bilateral investment treaties and those sort of things will protect people's investments, and well-structured, sensible contracts between private parties will also provide that protection. And the building blocks are already there. It doesn't need to be massively changed, I think. What does need to be addressed, of course, is regulation, health and safety regulation. And, what I hear again and again from clients is in order to encourage investment in a new sector, the more harmonious international regulation can be, the better. And I've heard some clients saying, wouldn't it be great if we had an international body governing hydrogen, it's important.
And you agree with that?
I don't see that it could cause
any harm,
and I think that done properly, it would oil, excuse the pun, oil the wheels of the hydrogen industry, because things that business need in a legal context are certainty and predictability,
which
and
comes from standardization to a degree.
Precisely. And an international body that could offer those standardized regulations would provide that, and therefore encourage the industry, it seems to me.
And make those perhaps a little uncomfortable, those who are a little less confident now in terms of investing, take 2 steps forward with it as well, and then unlock that scalability padlock that we were talking about earlier. Just before we wrap up, I'd just like to loop back to something you mentioned on damages, and that you are having a lot more inquiries when it comes to environmental damage, and that side of the picture, the more ethical perhaps side of the photo. And the IEA had a fantastic stat, said that the total market size of critical minerals like copper, cobalt, and various rare earth metals and many others grows almost 7-fold between 2020 and 2030 as per the net zero pathway. That's huge. And among that, there are a lot of ethical questions, because of course, those in developed nations have fallen short, most certainly in the past, when it comes to ethically harvesting materials needed for products that we use, computers, phones, and many others. I couldn't begin to list them all. What do you think needs to be done from a legal point of view to ensure there is that protection legally, but also that will then make sure it's ethical as well, in terms of harvesting the 7-fold growth in these minerals for all energy markets, not just hydrogen, all energy markets going forward?
I think that's a great question, Michelle, and I think the legal protections go hand in hand with ensuring those ethical concerns, because ultimately the laws that apply domestically and in a private or public international sphere are there to attain those goals. And I think what we'll see a lot more of is audits of contractual chains, because and those audits will look at 2 things. They'll look at how companies are aligned when it comes to the manner in which they deliver goods and services and achieving net zero, and doing so in a climate conscious way. If you do that, you minimize your risk then of being
sued. At a time when there is greater scrutiny as well.
Exactly. It's a question of risk management. If you build in the protections, you're naturally decreasing your risk of being sued either for damage or for greenwashing claims or for reputational damage. And the same thing goes with modern slavery and the conditions of workers. It's not good enough to say we have these policies, these are our public policies, and then subcontract or have joint ventures with companies that you haven't done your due diligence on.
And then say, well, we didn't know.
Exactly. Yeah. I didn't know is no longer an excuse, I think. And what investors, and we're talking here, the activist hedge funds, banks, any form of investors will be requiring companies that they've invested in is to say, what due diligence have you done? How can you ensure that the goals that you put out there, quite rightly, are being achieved all through the supply chain? And as you say, this applies very heavily in the energy transition. We can't just say a solution to the intermittency of renewables is huge amounts of batteries if the components of those batteries are being mined in an indiscriminate manner, which doesn't deal with those
almost
pollution
the subsidy
issues.
Of the worst kind.
Exactly. And so I think that this is something which I'm seeing in increasing amounts with our clients, is understanding how, again, come back to the first point, how the legislative and regulatory framework and reducing the risk to do with climate change matters can be baked into contractual relationships and ways of doing things at a board level, at an operational level. And that's where we can help by coming in and saying, these are the contractual clauses you need to be thinking about. These are the risks you need to be concerned about with modern slavery and climate change issues. And this is how you can you can protect yourself, and in doing so, achieve the goals that those legislation and regulation points are aimed to achieve.
And they have appetite to change. Is it a case of yes, we know we'll get to it? There's a lot going on right now, post-COVID, energy transition, economy. We'll get to those finer details of ethics and so on. We'll get to that. Or is it a case of absolutely, we know this is a prominent issue here and now, we need to fix it now? Well, what's the response you're getting?
Every company is different. And I think that what I can say is universal is a genuineness of an appreciation that even if it doesn't, even if as a moral point, it might not be very high on their list of things to achieve, net zero, climate change mitigation, modern day slavery, there is a hard-nosed understanding that there is risk out there which needs to be mitigated, and that there is money to be made from embracing these new ways of doing things. And I think that's the big change. It's the legal incentive, the risk management incentive, and the economic incentive, the commercial incentive to adopt these things. I think it's genuine. I really do. And I'm amazed at some of the clients I've been speaking to who are so driven to achieve their net zero goals, or go beyond net zero, to be carbon negative, and they are working, the in-house legal teams are working with their risk teams, but also their diversity and environmental sustainability champions to put practical measures in place to achieve these things. And I really do think there has been a sea change in the last probably 18 months or so.
And in a very worst case scenario, money talks. So if it's not the moral high ground, then the dollars will do a lot of change as well when it comes to that level of protection. Richard, thank you very much. I feel we've only really skimmed the surface of this. There's so many different areas to go into, and I think we've covered quite a wide range, but there's still so much. So I hope you can join us again, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Michelle. Pleasure.